My husband's body wasn't even cold when his brother leaned in to ask me about the house. I was still in my funeral dress, black silk that scratched against my neck like a quiet accusation, sitting in our front room with a cup of tea that had gone stone cold on the side table. The November air seeped through the old Tudor windows, and the scent of funeral lilies was already turning our home into something that smelled like a mausoleum. The guests were still murmuring in the hallway, a sea of dark suits and half-hearted sympathies, casseroles wrapped in foil, whispered condolences that felt rehearsed. And then Richard pulled his chair too close to mine. He was Derek's younger brother, a lawyer with soft hands and a smile that never quite reached his eyes. He leaned forward, dropping his voice to that conspiratorial whisper men use when they think they're doing a woman a favor. "Naomi," he said, patting my knee like I was a nervous dog. "Did Derek ever talk to you about the estate arrangements, the deed situation?" I looked at him like he had spoken a language I hadn't heard in decades. "The deed situation," I repeated. "Yes." He tapped his temple with a thick finger, a gesture so patronizing it made my stomach turn. "You know, in case you need help managing things. Legally speaking, we should be practical." I blinked. My mind was still foggy from the service, from the organ music that had seemed too loud, from standing beside that mahogany casket and accepting cold handshakes from people who told me what a wonderful man my husband had been. But somewhere beneath the fog, something stirred. "Richard," I said slowly, "Derek has been in the ground less than 5 hours. He had the decency to look uncomfortable, but only for a moment. I understand this is difficult," he said, offering that tight, oily smile. "But these things need to be handled. Derek was very specific in his wishes, and I want to make sure you're taken care of." Taken care of. I had heard that phrase my entire marriage. Derek used it like a lullaby. "Don't worry about the finances, Naomi. I'll take care of it. Don't fuss with the paperwork. I'll handle everything. You just rest." And I had. For 52 years, I had rested while my life was managed by someone else. "I'll call you next week," I told Richard, my voice flat. He opened his mouth to say something else, but something in my expression must have stopped him. He nodded, squeezed my shoulder, and retreated back to the other mourners. I sat there as the afternoon light faded through the heavy curtains. People came and went. They told me Derek had been a pillar of the community, a brilliant psychiatrist, a devoted husband. "You must be devastated," they said. "He adored you. You'll be so lost without him." And I nodded. I played my part. The grieving widow. The small, fragile woman left behind. But here's the truth. The truth I hadn't admitted even to myself until Richard tapped his temple and talked about managing me. I wasn't devastated. I wasn't lost. I was free. I just didn't know it yet. That evening, when the last car had finally pulled away and the quiet came crashing back into the house, I didn't go to bed. I walked the length of the hallway like a stranger in my own life. I looked at the Persian rugs I had vacuumed for 40 years, the heavy velvet curtains I had sewn myself in 1983 because Derek said store-bought looked cheap, the chipped mug on the kitchen counter that he hated because it didn't match our wedding china, but I had kept it hidden in the back of the cabinet anyway, a tiny rebellion I never spoke of. Everything looked the same, yet it felt different, hollow almost, echoing. I was still in that black dress. My feet ached. My body wanted sleep, but my feet had other plans. Without really deciding to, I found myself standing at the end of the hallway, in front of the one door I had never dared to touch in 52 years of marriage. His office. It was a plain wooden thing, dark mahogany with a brass handle that gleamed under the hallway light. Nothing remarkable about it, except that it was always locked. Always. I pressed my palm against the wood. It was cool to the touch. I could almost hear Derek's voice from the other side, the way I had heard it 1,000 times. "That's not for you, Naomi. Patient files, dear. Confidentiality. You wouldn't understand the medical terminology anyway. Go rest. You look tired." How many times had he said those words? How many times had he told me my memory was slipping, that I was overreacting, that I needed to take one of the little blue pills he prescribed to settle my nerves? I stood there for a long time, my hand flat against that door, feeling the grain of the wood against my palm. Then I went to bed. But I didn't sleep. I lay in the bed we had shared for half a century, staring at the ceiling, listening to the silence. The house made noises I had never noticed before. The settling of old bones, the whisper of wind against windows, the creak of floors that had held the weight of our marriage for so long. I kept expecting Derek to appear, to sit on the edge of the bed the way he used to and explain everything away. "It's for your own good, Naomi. You know how you get." But nothing came. Just the silence. And by morning I was exhausted, the kind of exhaustion that lives deep in your bones, past the muscle, right down to the marrow. I made tea but forgot to drink it. I stood in front of the bathroom mirror in my robe and barely recognized the woman staring back. Hair like melted silver, thin lips pressed together in a permanent line of worry, skin mapped with the wrinkles of 72 years. But there was something in my eyes, something I hadn't seen in a long time, a tired defiance. I touched my reflection. "Who are you?" I wondered. "Who have you become while he was watching you?" By noon I had made a decision. I didn't call Richard. I didn't call my son Thomas, who was a cardiologist in Boston and had worshipped his father. I didn't call my daughter Rebecca, who lived in Seattle and rarely came home for reasons she never fully explained. Instead, I went to the kitchen drawer where we kept the phone book. Yes, I still had a phone book. Derek never trusted the internet. And I found a number for a locksmith. My hands trembled as I dialed. "Henderson's locksmith, this is Jimmy." "I need someone to open a door," I said. "A door in my own house." "You lose your key, ma'am?" I looked down the hallway at that mahogany door, that locked, forbidden door. "No," I said. "I never had a key." A pause on the other end. Then, "I can be there by 2. "That would be fine." I hung up and realized my heart was pounding. Not from fear, from something else. Something that felt almost like anticipation. I got dressed. Not in black this time. I chose my navy blue cardigan, the one Derek said was too bold for a woman your age. I pinned my hair back. I made another cup of tea, and this time I drank it. And I waited. Jimmy arrived at 2 o'clock sharp. He was a man in his 40s with kind eyes, calloused hands, and the good sense not to ask too many questions. He looked at the lock and whistled low. "Old mechanism," he said, kneeling down to examine it. "Hasn't been changed since the 70s, I'd guess. They don't make 'em like this anymore." "No," I said, watching him work. "Control doesn't evolve. It calcifies." He glanced up at me, surprised, but he didn't say anything, just went back to his tools. It took him 15 minutes. 15 minutes to undo 52 years of secrets. When the lock finally clicked, a sharp metal snap that echoed through the quiet house like a gunshot, my heart slammed against my ribs. "There you go, ma'am," Jimmy said, standing up and wiping his hands on his jeans. "All yours now." I paid him in cash, walked him to the door, thanked him for his discretion. And then I was alone. I stood in the hallway, staring at that brass handle. The door was still closed, but it wasn't locked anymore. I could walk away. I could close it back up, call Richard, let him handle whatever was inside. I could go back to being the woman Derek had trained me to be. Quiet, compliant, confused, but something had shifted. Maybe it was the funeral. Maybe it was Richard's patronizing smile. Maybe it was 52 years of being told I wasn't capable of understanding my own life. I reached out, I turned the handle, and I pushed the door open. The smell hit me first. It wasn't rot. It wasn't mildew. It was the smell of age, of dust and leather and old paper and something faintly medicinal, like antiseptic that had soured over the decades. I stepped inside. The room was immaculate. I don't know what I had expected. Chaos, maybe? The scattered papers of a brilliant mind? But this was something else entirely. This was terrifying order. A large oak desk sat in the center of the room, its surface clean and bare except for a single green banker's lamp. Bookshelves lined every wall, floor to ceiling, but they weren't filled with medical textbooks or psychiatric journals. They were filled with black binders, hundreds of them, identical, neat, labeled with small white stickers on their spines. A leather chair, worn into the shape of Derek's body from years of sitting, faced the window. The curtains were drawn. No light came in from outside. I stepped closer to the shelves, squinting through my reading glasses at the labels. And then I stopped breathing. EM, medical EM. Correspondence EM, behavioral log. 2019, EM. Schedule monitoring, EM. Social contact analysis, EM. Eleanor Martin. My name, my birth name. The one I had before Derek convinced me to go by Naomi because Eleanor sounds like an old woman, and you're my young bride. I pulled one binder from the shelf. My hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped it. EM. Behavioral log, 2015. I opened it to a random page, and the world I thought I knew crumbled to dust. June 3rd. Subject returned from grocery store 22 minutes later than estimated. No satisfactory explanation provided. Exhibited flushed appearance upon questioning. Note: increased surveillance of social interactions during errands. September 14th. Subject refused evening medication. Became verbally resistant when pressed. Argumentative regarding household finances. Administered backup sedative in evening tea. Reinforced need for rest the following morning. October 2nd. Subject exhibited emotional dysregulation during breakfast, crying. No apparent trigger. Possible hormonal fluctuation despite postmenopausal status. Monitor for escalation. Consider medication adjustment. I remembered October 2nd, 2015. I remembered it perfectly. I had cried that morning because Derek forgot my birthday. Not just forgot, he had scheduled a golf game with colleagues and left before I woke up. When I mentioned it that evening, he looked at me with that familiar pity in his eyes and said, "Naomi, I think you're confused. Your birthday isn't until next month." But it was my birthday. I knew it was. Didn't I? By the end of that week, I wasn't sure anymore. Derek had me so turned around that I actually checked my driver's license to confirm my own birth date. And the whole time, he had been documenting it. Cataloging my tears as emotional dysregulation. Recording my confusion as a symptom rather than what it really was. A woman realizing her husband was a liar. I slammed the binder shut. My hands weren't shaking anymore. They were steady. Rock steady. Because I wasn't sad. I wasn't confused. I was furious. I looked around that room, at the hundreds of binders, at the decades of surveillance, at the meticulous records of a man who had treated his wife like a lab rat. This wasn't a husband's study. This was a prison warden's office, and I had been the inmate who didn't know she was locked up. I stood there for a long time, letting the reality sink in. 52 years. 52 years of being watched, recorded, medicated, manipulated. 52 years of being told I was fragile when I was just disagreeing. 52 years of apologizing for having opinions. But I was still here. I was still standing. And Derek? Derek was in the ground. I walked to the desk and sat down in his leather chair, the chair that had held the shape of his body for so long. The leather creaked beneath me, a sound I had heard 1,000 times from the hallway, but never from this side. There was a cream-colored envelope on the desk, my name written on it in Derek's careful handwriting. Naomi. I opened it. Inside was not a love letter, not an apology, not a goodbye, just a typed list. Instructions for Naomi Martin upon my death. 1. Contact Richard immediately regarding financial accounts. 2. Do not attempt to access my office or files. 3. Legal matters will be handled through the trust. 4. Continue psychiatric treatment as previously arranged. 5. All decisions regarding the estate to be coordinated through executor. 6. Avoid stress. Focus on routine. Take medications as prescribed. I read it twice. Even dead, he was still giving me orders. Even from the grave, he expected me to obey. I let the paper fall from my fingers to the floor. "No," I said out loud, to the empty room, to the ghost of the man who had controlled me for half a century. "No, Derek, not anymore." I looked at the shelves full of binders, at the secrets he had kept, at the cage he had built around me, bar by bar, year by year, and for the first time in 52 years, I smiled. "Let's see what else you were hiding." I spent 3 days in that room. 3 days of pulling binders from shelves. 3 days of reading my own life through the eyes of the man who had controlled it. 3 days of watching 52 years of marriage dissolve into something I barely recognized. I only left to eat, to use the bathroom, to make more tea that went cold on the desk beside me. The house phone rang several times. I didn't answer. Richard left 2 messages, his voice increasingly irritated, about paperwork that needed attention. Thomas called once, brief and businesslike, asking if I needed him to fly in. I didn't call back. I had more important things to do. I had a life to excavate. The medical files. The first binder I pulled was labeled EM, Medical, 1998 to 2008. Inside were copies of every prescription Derek had ever written for me. Anti-anxiety medication, sleep aids, mood stabilizers. Drugs I had taken for years because my husband, the doctor, the expert, the man who knew best, told me I needed them. There were notes in the margins. His handwriting, neat and clinical. Increased dosage if subject exhibits agitation. Patient shows resistance to morning medication. Consider liquid form in coffee. Emotional volatility following mother's death. Extended sedation protocol recommended. I stopped at that last note. My mother died in 1998. Breast cancer. She fought for 2 years and lost, and I had wanted to fly to California to be with my sister Helen during those final weeks. Derek said I was too fragile to travel. He said the stress would be too much for me. He gave me a little blue pill and a glass of water, and he told me to rest. And I did. I rested through my mother's funeral. I rested through the burial. I rested while my sister scattered ashes into the Pacific Ocean without me. When I finally woke up, 3 weeks had passed. Derek told me I had been unwell, that I had needed time to process my grief. But I hadn't processed anything. I had been sedated, deliberately, chemically, so that I wouldn't leave. I closed the binder and pressed my hands flat against the desk to stop them from shaking. Breathe, I told myself. Keep reading. You need to see all of it. The correspondence files. The second binder was worse. EM, correspondence, 1990 to 2000. Inside were letters. My letters. Letters I had written to my sister Helen in California. Letters to my college friend Gloria. Birthday cards I had sent to nieces and nephews. Every single one had been photocopied before being mailed. Some had notes in red ink, circles around certain phrases, comments in the margins. Concerning tone, subject mentions feeling trapped, monitor for escalation. References desire to visit Helen, denied, cited health concerns. Mentions writing again, creative pursuits to be discouraged, redirect to household tasks. I had wanted to write. Back in the 70s, before Thomas was born, I had written poetry. Nothing remarkable, just small verses about gardens and seasons and the way light fell through windows in the morning. Derek had read them once and smiled that tight smile of his. "That's nice, dear," he'd said, "but perhaps you should focus on more practical things." I never wrote another poem, and now I knew why. Every time I showed interest in something beyond the house, beyond him, he had noted it, flagged it, found ways to redirect me back to the cage he was building. But the worst discovery was in the back of the binder. Letters that had never reached me. Letters from Gloria, my closest friend from college. She had written to me for years, birthday cards, holiday notes, long letters asking why I never called anymore, why I seemed so distant when we spoke. I had never seen any of them. There was a sticky note on the bundle in Derek's handwriting. G. Patterson, disruptive influence, encourages independence. Correspondence intercepted as of 1995. Subject informed friend moved away. No further contact. I remembered 1995. I remembered asking Derek if Gloria had called, and him shaking his head sadly. "I'm sorry, Naomi. I think she's just busy with her own life. People drift apart." I had believed him. I had mourned that friendship like a death. And the whole time Gloria had been reaching out to me. The whole time she had been trying to hold on. I gathered the letters, the ones she had sent, the ones he had stolen, and I held them against my chest like something precious. "I'm sorry, Gloria," I whispered to the empty room. "I'm so sorry." There were 40 years of behavioral logs, 40 binders, one for each year, hundreds of pages of observations, notes, and clinical assessments of a woman who was not a patient. She was a wife. I pulled 2003 at random. March 15th, subject expressed desire to return to teaching, cited boredom and lack of purpose, reminded subject of previous anxiety episodes related to workplace stress, suggested volunteer work at church instead. Subject acquiesced. I had wanted to go back to teaching. I had been a 3rd-grade teacher before we married. I had loved it, loved the children, loved the feeling of watching small minds open to the world. Derek had encouraged me to quit when Thomas was born. "The children need you at home," he said, and I had agreed. But in 2003, both kids were grown. Thomas was in medical school. Rebecca had just graduated from college. The house was empty, and I was drowning in silence. I mentioned teaching again, and Derek had reminded me, gently, always so gently, that I wasn't stable enough for the classroom, that the stress would trigger my episodes, that I should find something quieter, something manageable, something safe. So I had volunteered at the church, folding bulletins, arranging flowers, work that required nothing of my mind, and I had believed I wasn't capable of more. June 22nd. Subject questioned household budget, wanted access to bank statements, expressed frustration at not knowing where the money goes, redirected conversation, administered evening medication early, subject calmer by morning. September 3rd. Subject received phone call from Sister Helen. Conversation lasted 47 minutes. Subject appeared agitated afterward, mentioned possible trip to California, reminded subject of travel anxiety. Trip declined. November 28th. Subject burned Thanksgiving turkey, exhibited disproportionate emotional response, crying, self-criticism. Possible depressive episode. Increased morning medication by 10 milligrams. I burned a turkey. And cried about it because I was embarrassed. Because Derek's colleagues were coming for dinner and I had ruined the meal. A normal reaction. A human reaction. And he had documented it as mental illness. Every tear, every frustration, every moment of disappointment or anger or simple human sadness, he had turned it into a symptom. He had built a case against my sanity, page by page, year by year, until even I believed I was broken. In the bottom drawer of the desk, I found photographs, pictures of me through windows, through doorways, taken without my knowledge. Me washing dishes, looking tired. Me sitting alone in the garden, staring at nothing. Me asleep on the couch with a book fallen open on my chest. Each photograph had a caption. Subject exhibits depressive posture. Consider activity restriction. Subject isolated in garden for 2+ hours. Monitor for withdrawal symptoms. Sleep disturbance noted. Increased nighttime sedation. He had been photographing me, in my own home, like a specimen, like an experiment. I felt sick. I pushed back from the desk and walked to the window, drew back the heavy curtains, the curtains that had kept this room dark for 52 years, and let the gray November light pour in. The world outside looked exactly the same. Our suburban street with its neat lawns and bare trees. Mrs. Henderson walking her dog. The Peterson kids riding bicycles. Normal life, going on as if nothing had changed. But everything had changed. I turned back to the room, to the binders, to the photographs, to the mountain of evidence that my husband had built against me. I thought I was living a marriage, I said aloud, my voice strange in the silence. But I was living in an experiment, and I was the only one who didn't know. On the 4th day, I found the safe. It was hidden behind a velvet curtain in the corner of the room, brushed steel, medium-sized, with a digital keypad. Derek used to joke about it at parties. "A man needs one secret in his life," he'd say with that tight half-smile. "Just a place for old love letters and a bottle of good scotch." Everyone would laugh. I never thought to question what was actually inside. I tried his birthday. Error. His mother's birthday. Error. The year we married. Error. I sat back, thinking. What mattered most to Derek? What would he keep closest to his heart? I looked around the room, at the shrine to control, at the meticulous documentation of my entire existence, and I realized the answer. I found his leather planner in the desk drawer, flipped to the back, and there, circled in red ink among a list of account numbers and passwords, was a date. June 17th, our wedding anniversary. I went back to the safe, punched in 0617. Click, the door swung open. Inside were 3 items. The first was a thick legal envelope. Last will and testament, confidential. The second was a yellow folder labeled Declaration of Incapacity, EM. The third was a small, locked metal box. I reached for the yellow folder first. My hands trembled as I opened it. Inside was a legal document. Prepared, signed, notarized, dated 6 months ago. It declared that I, Eleanor Naomi Martin was suffering from severe cognitive decline, that I was unable to manage my personal or financial affairs, that I required a legal guardian to make decisions on my behalf. The document was signed by 2 physicians. One name I didn't recognize, but the other, Dr. William Hartley, I knew. He had come to our Christmas party last year. He was a colleague of Derek's, a jovial man with a red face who drank too much eggnog. At some point during the evening, he had asked me if I often forgot where I put my keys. I had laughed. "Doesn't everyone?" And he had exchanged a look with Derek, a look I hadn't understood at the time. Now I understood. They had been evaluating me, diagnosing me. Over roast beef and Christmas carols, they had been building a case to declare me incompetent. I opened the will next. 20 pages of dense legal language. I forced myself to read through it, skipping the formalities until I found the heart of it. All liquid assets, property, and investments to remain in a trust managed by Richard Martin until such time as Eleanor Martin is deemed competent to assume control. Should Eleanor Martin require assisted living, the estate shall cover expenses, provided the guardian approves the facility. In the event of cognitive decline, her care is to be prioritized over discretionary spending. Unused funds revert to the family trust. He had left me nothing. Not really. I could live in the house, but I couldn't own it. I could have my bills paid, but I couldn't write a check. I was to be a guest in my own life, dependent on the benevolence of Richard, the brother-in-law who had asked about the deed before Derek's body was cold. And if they ever filed that incapacity declaration, if they ever convinced a judge that I couldn't manage my own affairs, I would lose everything. The house, the money, my right to make my own decisions. Derek had been planning to take it all. He had been building a cage so complete that even death wouldn't release me from it. The only reason he hadn't finished was because his heart gave out first. He died before he could steal the last of my freedom. I sat in his chair for a long time, holding those documents. The safe was still open. The metal box was still inside, untouched. I reached for it, found a small key taped to the underside of the desk drawer, unlocked it. Inside was a checkbook for an account I didn't know existed, a joint account with both our names that Derek had never mentioned, and beneath it, a single piece of paper, a note, in his handwriting, just one line, "In case you ever found the door." I read those words 3 times, in case you ever found the door. He knew. Somewhere deep in that twisted mind of his, Derek knew that someday I might wake up, that someday I might question the locks and the pills and the gentle redirections, that someday I might find the courage to open the door he had forbidden me to touch. And instead of destroying the evidence, instead of burning the binders and shredding the documents, he had kept everything. Why? Because he was arrogant, because he thought his cruelty was a masterpiece, because he wanted me to see how thoroughly he had controlled me, how completely he had managed my entire existence. Or maybe he was daring me. One final test, one last experiment. Go ahead, Naomi, see what I really thought of you. See if you're strong enough to do anything about it. I folded the note carefully and placed it in my pocket. Then I stood up. I walked to the desk and found a fresh manila folder. I wrote on it in thick black marker, E.M. Evidence. I began to fill it. The incapacity declaration, the will, the prescriptions, the intercepted letters, photographs of the most damning pages from the behavioral logs. My hands weren't shaking anymore. They were steady. Because this wasn't about grief. This wasn't about shock. This was about war. And for the first time in 52 years, I was ready to fight. The first call I made was to Gloria. It was nearly midnight. I sat in the kitchen with the bundle of her stolen letters spread across the table, my hands wrapped around a cup of chamomile tea that had gone cold hours ago. I dialed the number from her last letter, the one from 2003, the final attempt she had made before giving up. It rang 4 times. I almost hung up. Then, "Hello?" A sleepy voice, confused. The voice of a woman who hadn't received a phone call this late in decades. "Gloria," I said, "it's Naomi. Naomi Martin." Silence. A sharp intake of breath. "Naomi?" Her voice cracked. "My God, I saw the obituary. I thought about calling, but I didn't think you'd... I mean, after all these years." "I know," I said. "I know you wrote to me, Gloria. For years. I know you called. I know you tried." What? He kept them. My voice was steady now, calm in a way that surprised me. Derek kept all your letters. I found them, in his office. He intercepted them. He told me you had moved away, that we had drifted apart. He lied about everything. I heard her crying on the other end of the line. Soft, wounded sounds. I knew something was wrong, she said finally. You used to be so bright, Naomi, so full of fire, and then you just faded. Every time I called, he answered. Every time I visited, you seemed like you were reading from a script. I thought you didn't want me anymore. I was managed, I whispered. That's the word for it. I was managed. Oh, honey. Gloria's voice strengthened, that fierce protectiveness I remembered from our college days surging back. What do you need? What can I do? I need someone to believe me, I said. I need someone who remembers who I was before him. I remember. Gloria's voice was fierce now, the voice of the woman who had once marched for civil rights and called out professors who underestimated us. I remember exactly who you were, and I'm coming over tomorrow. I'm bringing lasagna and wine, and you are going to show me everything. I smiled, actually smiled, for the first time in days. I'd like that, I said. Naomi? Yes? I'm proud of you, for opening that door. I looked down at the letters spread across my kitchen table. All those years of friendship, stolen. All those years of connection, erased. I should have opened it sooner, I said. You opened it when you were ready. That's what matters. Gloria arrived the next afternoon with a casserole dish and a bottle of Cabernet. She looked older, of course. We both did. But her eyes still held that spark of defiance that had drawn me to her 50 years ago in our freshman dormitory. Her hair was silver now, cut short in a practical bob, and she wore purple like a badge of honor. Well, she said, setting the lasagna on the counter and pulling me into a fierce hug. Show me everything. We sat at the kitchen table for hours. I spread out the documents, the photographs, the pages from the behavioral logs. Gloria read through them with a growing expression of horror. When she reached the note about herself, G. Patterson, disruptive influence, encourages independence, she laughed, but it was a wet, angry sound. He was terrified of me, she said, tapping the paper. Look at this. He wasn't protecting you, Naomi. He was guarding his prisoner. I helped him, I said quietly. Every time I stayed silent. Every time I apologized for having an opinion. I handed him the tools to build that cage. Gloria reached across the table and grabbed my hand. Listen to me, she said. You were a victim of something deliberate, something planned. This isn't like burning dinner and your husband gets mad. This is systematic. This is calculated. And the fact that you survived it, that you're sitting here now, putting the pieces together, tells me you're a hell of a lot stronger than he ever gave you credit for. I squeezed her hand back. I don't feel strong, I admitted. I feel like I wasted 52 years. You didn't waste them, Gloria said firmly. You survived them. There's a difference. And now you're going to make damn sure he doesn't win from the grave. 2 days later, I received an unexpected visitor. I was in Derek's office. I had started thinking of it as the evidence room, organizing documents into categories when the doorbell rang. I wasn't expecting anyone. Gloria had gone home to pack a bag. She was planning to stay with me through whatever came next. I opened the door to find my granddaughter Sophie standing on the porch. She was 19, a sophomore at NYU, with black nail polish and sharp eyes that missed nothing. She had been avoiding family gatherings for the past year. I had assumed it was the typical distance of young adulthood, but now I wondered. Grandma, she said, can I come in? Of course, sweetheart. She followed me inside, looking around the house as if seeing it for the first time. When I led her to the office, to the room with its shelves of black binders, she stopped in the doorway. What is this? She asked. This, I said, is what your grandfather was really doing for 52 years. I watched her walk along the shelves, reading the labels. Watched her face go pale as she pulled down a binder at random and flipped through the pages. This is about you, she said. All of this. It's like a stalker's journal. It's called coercive control, I said. That's the legal term for it. Sophie set down the binder. She looked at me with eyes that were suddenly too old for her face. Grandma, I need to tell you something. What is it? She took a deep breath. Last year, I overheard Grandpa on the phone with Uncle Richard. They were in the study at the Christmas party. They didn't know I was in the hallway. Grandpa said, he said you were no longer manageable. He said it was time for legal measures. I thought he was worried about you, like maybe you were sick and needed help. But now, she gestured at the room around us. Now I understand what he really meant. I felt something shift in my chest. Not surprise. I was beyond surprise at this point, but a kind of validation. Someone else had seen it. Someone else knew. Why didn't you tell anyone? I asked gently. Who would have believed me? Sophie's voice cracked. Dad worships Grandpa. Mom barely talks to this side of the family. And you? Every time I tried to talk to you about anything serious, you seemed so tired, so far away. I didn't think you'd hear me. I was medicated, I said. For most of your life, I was kept just sedated enough to be compliant. Not enough to be obvious, but enough to make me foggy. Sophie's eyes filled with tears. That's so messed up. Yes, I agreed. It is. She crossed the room and hugged me, a fierce, tight embrace that reminded me so much of Gloria. You're not crazy, Grandma, she whispered against my shoulder. You're the sanest person in this family. Thank you, sweetheart, I said, stroking her hair. That means more than you know. Sophie stayed for dinner that night. We ordered pizza, something Derek would never have allowed in the house, and sat on the living room floor like teenagers, surrounded by papers and photographs and the wreckage of a 52-year lie. What are you going to do? Sophie asked, wiping tomato sauce from her chin. I'm going to fight, I said. I'm going to hire a lawyer and challenge the will and make sure your grandfather doesn't control me from the grave. Good. Sophie nodded firmly. You should. But Grandma, what about Dad? I sighed. Thomas, my son, the one who had inherited Derek's cool demeanor and clinical detachment, the one who had never questioned his father's authority. I don't know, I admitted. He spent his whole life believing his father was a good man. Finding out the truth might break him. Or it might set him free too, Sophie said quietly. You're not the only one Grandpa controlled. He just used different methods with Dad. Made him feel like he had to be perfect. Made him feel like love was something you had to earn. I looked at my granddaughter, this fierce, perceptive young woman who saw things the rest of us had missed. When did you get so wise? I asked. She shrugged. Therapy. Lots of therapy. You should try it sometime. I laughed. A real laugh. The first one in longer than I could remember. Maybe I will, I said. Once this is over. A week after the funeral, Richard appeared on my doorstep. I had been expecting him. He stood on the porch looking disheveled, tie crooked, hair uncombed, the confident veneer cracking around the edges. He had heard about my activities, about the lawyer I had consulted, about the fact that I was no longer answering his calls or following his suggestions. Naomi, he said, his voice tight. We need to talk. No, I said. We don't. I started to close the door, but he put his hand against it. You're making a mistake, he said. A serious mistake. Derek's will is very specific. If you try to contest it, I'll be forced to release the medical records. I'll show the court that you're unstable, that you've been unstable for years. Is that a threat, Richard? It's a fact. His voice dropped, trying for that same patronizing tone Derek used to use. You're confused, Naomi. You've just lost your husband. You're not thinking clearly. Let me help you. Let me handle things the way Derek wanted. Something ignited in my chest, a flame that had been smoldering for decades. I pushed open the screen door and stepped onto the porch, forcing Richard to stumble backward. Let me tell you what's going to happen, I said, my voice rising with each word. You are going to take your threats and your handling, and you are going to get off my property. Because I have spent 52 years being told that I'm confused, that I'm unstable, that I need to be managed like a child or a patient or a pet. Richard's face went red. Naomi, I'm not finished. I took another step forward. He took another step back. I have 500 pages of documentation in that house. 500 pages of evidence that my husband treated me like a lab experiment, that he medicated me to keep me compliant, that he isolated me from everyone who cared about me, that he was planning to have me declared incompetent so he could control my assets even after death. That's not, and I have a lawyer now, Richard, a very good one, who can't wait to show a judge exactly what kind of protection Derek had in mind for me. We stood there, 2 feet apart, the November wind cutting between us. Richard's confident mask slipped. Behind it, I saw something I recognized. The same cold calculation Derek used to have. The same assumption that women like me would eventually fold. "You're going to regret this," he said. "The only thing I regret," I said, "is the 52 years I spent believing I wasn't capable of standing on my own 2 feet. I stepped back inside my house. "Get off my porch, Richard," I said, "and tell your lawyers to expect a subpoena." I closed the door in his face, and then I stood in my hallway, shaking, not from fear, but from the pure electric rush of finally saying what should have been said decades ago. That night I couldn't sleep, but for once it wasn't anxiety keeping me awake. It was something else, something that felt almost like hope. I walked through the house in my robe, touching things I had never really seen before. The walls I had painted, the curtains I had sewn, the garden I had planted and tended for 40 years. This was my house, my life, my story, and I was finally ready to tell it. I stopped in front of the hallway mirror, the same mirror where I had barely recognized myself just a week ago. The woman looking back at me was still 72, still silver-haired, still lined with the wrinkles of half a century. But something was different. Her eyes were clear, her shoulders were straight, and there was fire in her expression, a fire that had been smothered for 52 years but had never quite gone out. "There you are," I whispered to my reflection. "I've been looking for you."